Well, hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Heidi Tworek. I'm an associate professor in international history and public policy at the University of British Columbia, joining you from Vancouver, Canada today. So it's good morning from me, but good afternoon or good evening from my fellow panelists. Today, we have a stellar group of people here to talk with us about online platform responsibilities and intermediary liability, the evolving picture. We have Daphne Keller, the director of the program on platform regulation at the Cyber Policy Center at Stanford University. We have Dr. Wilhelm Eschweiler, who's the vice president of the Federal Network Agency in Germany. Markham Eriksson, the vice president of government affairs and public policy at Google. And finally, Matt Allison, who is the senior public policy manager of the data, platforms, and AI, group policy and public affairs at Vodafone. So please do, as you're listening to each of our panelists, put your questions in the Q&A that you see on the right-hand side of your screen. Please put them through at any time. I will be trying to filter in those questions as I can throughout the panel. So please put them in as soon as they occur to you. So what we'll do is we'll start with some opening statements around the question of what's been the most important change in the last few years in our understanding of intermediary liability, hear from each one of our panelists, and then get into a discussion. So as I said, please put your questions in the Q&A as soon as they occur to you so I can make sure to flow them into our discussion of the next 80 minutes. So as I said, the first thing that I'd love to hear from each of our panelists, because this has been in many ways such a fast-moving space in terms of our understanding, at least, is to reflect on what has been the most important change in the last few years in our understanding of intermediary liability? And I'm going to go to Daphne Keller first and ask her to give us her thoughts on that question.
Great. Thank you, Heidi. And thank you for including me in this great event. So I've been working on intermediary liability laws internationally since 2004 and in the US a bit before that. So my arc may be a little bit longer than the past 5 years. But what I see is a very clear shift from concern about the power of government to suppress speech to a concern about the power of private platform companies to do the same thing, to act as a censor or to amplify harmful speech, to act as gatekeepers for public discussion. And so with this shift from a focus on government power to platform power, I'd say, the most important laws and cases from 5 to 10 years ago were things like the Marco Civil in Brazil, Supreme Court cases in India and Argentina, all saying some version of don't let powerful people bully platforms into silencing their users. You should have courts and public processes before platforms have to take things down. Is sort of a major takeaway from the laws of that era. And that remains an important principle for some situations today. Powerful bullies in government and elsewhere haven't gone away. Platforms do routinely get improper demands to remove speech that's not only legal but important. And this includes government abuses trying to silence critical journalism, businesses trying to knock their competitors offline by alleging that they did something illegal and trying to get platforms to take them down. And empirical research shows that platforms tend to comply with these improper requests. And so to avoid the risk of silencing the wrong people or cutting off access to customers for the wrong businesses, the law has to respond to that reality and have mechanisms in place to avoid abusive takedown efforts. Now, though, in this era of greater focus on platforms' responsibilities, we see a lot of things like the Digital Services Act in the EU and proposals to amend Communications Decency Act 230, CDA 230 in the US. We see ideas that are about keeping platforms themselves in check. And so this is things like process rules for enforcement of terms of service and community guidelines, so requirements that the rules be clear, requirements that users be able to appeal takedown determinations, public transparency requirements. In Europe, in the DSA proposals, we're seeing ideas about regulatory oversight of how the systems for content removal work within platforms. An idea of sort of managing those systems much as you would manage, say, emissions or food safety, as systems rather than as a series of potential tort claims. And hopefully within those laws, we will also see robust size-based limits so that laws designed for the Facebooks or YouTubes or Googles of the world don't get applied to the smaller entities that rely on the same immunities. They don't get applied to your aunt's knitting blog or to a small retailer whose site allows user comments and so forth. So I think both of these principles, the sort of being wary of bullies using platforms to silence the wrong people, and simultaneously being wary of the power of platforms to act as gatekeepers and exercise that power improperly, they both should be part of the path forward for both the EU and the US, which are in major lawmaking processes now, and for the rest of the world. There's actually a great piece by former FCC Commissioner Susan Ness on this today in Slate, talking about ways that by focusing on process rather than content, the EU and the US can coordinate under the coming Biden administration. So I look forward to discussing this further and hearing from the other panelists.
Yeah, thanks so much, Daphne. So I was thinking as you were talking, the one other kind of strand here is in a way the move from focusing on individual posts to focusing on processes. Do you think that's fair? And maybe I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about why you think these shifts have taken place. Is it the classic Brexit US election, or are there other things going on that are about our understanding of the platforms themselves?
Well, I think that this shift in focus tracks a genuine rise in platform power. There are more people every day depending on private companies to mediate our communication, particularly in the era of COVID. And so there are more people recognizing the potential problems, more people finding themselves on the wrong end of a takedown error, or finding themselves on the wrong end of seeing content that is harmful or even illegal. And so I think it's not very surprising. There's also an element, that there's been public pressure on platforms for a number of years to take down more things. Newspaper articles and politicians rightly pointing to, say, violent extremist content and demanding that platforms take action. But precisely because platforms operate at such massive scale, what taking action means is things like adopting automated filtering systems that make a lot of mistakes and that do take down the wrong things, and that in some cases maybe are taking down the wrong things in ways that have disparate impact. We have studies showing automated systems hurting the lawful speech of African-American speakers more than white American speakers, for example. And so a lot of the pressure on platforms to take responsibility has led to them doing things that actually have collateral damage that's hard for people to see up front, and which, as you say, kind of justifies this greater focus on what the systems are rather than on individual outcomes.
Yeah, exactly. Because then when we start investigating the individual outcomes, we find all of these unintended consequences very different than the pressure of what people were thinking was going to come from that. So I'd like to then bring into the conversation Matt Allison, who is hopefully there. Matt, are you with us? Otherwise, we will wait for a second, as he might be having internet connections, and maybe we'll move on to Markham Eriksson, who's looking at this from a very different perspective from inside the company of Google. So maybe you want to tell us how you see this question of intermediary liability evolving. What's been your sense of the most important changes over the last few?
Yes, well, thank you, and it's good to be here. At chagrined we couldn't be in person. But this is the next best thing. Look, of course, it's timely and appropriate to have this conversation about the role of intermediaries, Section 230, the e-commerce directive. I find both Section 230 and to some degree the e-commerce directive have become a bit of a Rorschach test for people that have anything to complain about on the internet. It's sort of the go-to framework to say it ought to be reformed. I think often it's not the case, but they've become that kind of talisman. In the EU, in the US, of course, and this has become clear in the last couple of months, what those solutions are not without controversy. So there's a large segment of critics that would say that internet platforms are not taking down enough, are not moderating content robustly enough. And there's a large set of critics on the other side that are complaining that internet platforms are putting their thumbs on the scale of too much speech and taking down too much content, and should be less involved in moderating content. Of course, to some degree, a regulatory solution that reconciles those two disparate points of view would be indeed hard to see how that could be adopted. It's been 25 years roughly since Section 230 was adopted and the e-commerce directive were adopted, and I think it's in my mind it's still important to recognize that some first principles, as much as things have been criticized, and those are such principles as recognizing the distinction between content providers and intermediaries. I think mostly policymakers understand that difference and support the distinction, and there ought to be distinctions there in the law. That wasn't the case necessarily in 1996 or in a couple of years beforehand of thinking about what kind of regime we ought to have. That there ought to be, secondly, incentives for intermediaries to protect their consumers and users, and to create a safe environment for people that are visiting their site. And then to some degree also concepts that the intermediaries should not be in a position of making sophisticated legal decisions about the nature of third-party content, or be policing their platforms for content by mandate of law. What we've learned, I think, or at least seen in operation, is the importance of having legal clarity in this space, and particularly, as you rightly point out, in a time where we're struggling with this global pandemic of COVID, we've spent an enormous amount of time and effort and resources to work with health authorities to raise up authoritative content and promote authoritative content and provide tools for people to find access to information, as well as in terms of health information and information about where they can be tested. The vaccines, as they begin rolling out, it'll be the same effort to raise up that kind of authoritative content about the nature of the vaccines and how they can be accessed. And at the same time, rigorously taking down harmful, misleading content, and that medically that could be harmful to people if they were to believe the misinformation. Having some legal certainty around our ability to do that certainly makes it. Foments our ability to take both of those things, raising up authoritative content and taking down harmful content. As far as where we go from here, what we've learned, I think it's right we're having the conversation, in that internet companies, technology are increasingly ubiquitous in our lives. People want to understand the trajectory of innovation, how information that they see, whether it's trustworthy or not. I think, as Daphne mentioned, there seems to be some agreement around transparency, around looking at processes to create a sense of trust, and rather than looking at individual content decisions. And I think that's probably an appropriate and healthy way to look at this. Going beyond sort of that, accountability and transparency, I think, becomes then very difficult in terms of, and potentially dangerous in terms of having governments weigh in on specific content decisions. And then the last point I'll just end with is, I still think we don't have a common language globally. I think there are agreements in pockets of the direction we want to go. But as we've seen in the United States, there's still a lot of conversation that are diametrically opposed to each other on the role of intermediaries relative to third-party content, whether they take down too much or take down too little, and how intrusive regulatory regimes ought to be. So I think we are trending in a direction where we're getting better understanding about what intermediaries and platforms are doing, their processes, and working toward systems of accountability and demonstrating that accountability through transparent processes and through explaining and getting to some sort of common view among platforms on how to best protect their users.
Oh, thanks so much. Lots of questions for us to delve into. And maybe if I can just ask one follow-up. I wonder, because you said, I think quite rightly, that we don't yet have a common global language. And Daphne and I were both in part of a group that Susan Ness organized about a transatlantic working group. And one part of that was exactly this idea of trying to figure out, are we all talking about the same thing? So I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about what you think transparency is. Transparency of what exactly? Because sometimes we all say transparency, but we, again, mean something different. So what do you think when you think of
Sure. Well, I tend to think of transparency as one, transparency on the kind of decisions that a platform would make, their principles on how they want to protect their users and consumers. And then transparency about the processes, how they make decisions. And so I sort of see those in two different categories. And of course, how we demonstrate the transparency is still a conversation that we have to have. And there's probably some set of co-responsibilities between governments and intermediaries, but I largely see the transparency in those two buckets.
Thanks very much, and I think this is a perfect time to turn to Dr. Wilhelm Eschweiler, who is speaking to us from Germany, in part because Germany's law, the Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz or the NetzDG, one part that every group agreed on was the importance of transparency reports and how that had pushed forward the conversation. So please, Dr. Eschweiler, why don't you tell us what have been the most important changes in the last few years from your perspective in our understanding of intermediary liability?
Hello to everybody, and thank you for giving me the floor and for the opportunity to speak here at the ICC's online conference. The panel is dealing with a very hot topic of online platform responsibility and intermediary liability. In this context, I have to clarify that my authority is not in charge of content regulation. However, we are dealing with economic regulation and various digital issues. Therefore, I will focus on aspects of economic regulation of digital platforms. As intermediaries, digital platforms have the ability to connect distinctive group of users through their services by facilitating access to goods and services. Digital platforms bring huge benefits for both. That means business and end customers. However, there are also increasing concerns over the concentrated position of some digital platforms and the heavy dependency of businesses on digital platforms. Nowadays, some digital platforms are able to control important platform ecosystems in the digital economy. Due to network effects, privileged access of data, and exclusive control over key interfaces, some digital platforms are in a position to act as gatekeepers or unavoidable trading partners. This enables them to unilaterally set the rules for the game and for their users and their competitors, not always in a fair manner. This is also a development that we see in Germany. Last spring, we started the platform monitoring exercise by asking business customers about their experience with digital platforms in Germany. And the interim results unfortunately confirmed our concerns. Especially small and medium-sized companies considered sales and marketing activities via digital platform as important or even very important. The majority of participants make more than half of their revenue in Germany via such digital platforms. Nearly 3/4 would see themselves having considerable difficulties without the use of digital platforms for marketing and sales activities. Overall, 1/2 assume they would have not even be able to exist. At the same time, the participants reported about various difficulties in their business relationship with digital platforms. More than half reported having experienced difficulties in the areas of complaint management, dealing with customer or product ratings, commissions or other fees, and the dual role of vertical integrated platform operators. Against this background, we welcome the European Commission's consideration to establish a new regulatory framework with ex-ante rules for certain digital platforms. We also see the necessity to allow for quick and effective remedial actions. A new regulatory approach should combine directly applicable ex-ante rules of behavior and, if necessary, further tailored remedies for platforms with significant intermediary power. Rules of behavior should include further transparency, as my colleague has pointed it out, and non-discrimination rules, including a ban of self-preferencing. However, more complex and intrusive obligations such as interoperability or data portability should rather be dealt with by tailored remedies. Even if the focus of such a new regulatory intervention will take place on EU level, national regulatory authorities will have to play a role here. We are convinced about that. We are convinced that telecom regulators, with their many years of experience in ex-ante monitoring and regulation of telecommunication markets, as well as digital services, are perfectly suited to provide the national implementation and monitoring of this approach. Already today, my authority enforces ex-ante rules in digital areas, for example, with regard to net neutrality, geo-blocking, and international roaming rules. So there is a lot of expertise on our side. To sum up, we are ready to take over, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. So I wonder if I could just follow up with one question, which is if you could delve a little bit more into how you see that division of labor between national authorities and the EU level. Maybe you could just give us a little bit more detail on how you see that functioning.
Yes, it depends if there is a for instance, if there is a pan-European influence, these platforms are dealing in, there are problems in, for instance, 2 or 3 or 4 member states of the European Union. I think we must be honest to say this is a problem on the EU level. So the Commission, or for instance, the BEREC, that is the body of the European regulators, would step in place. If there is just a national problem, it's upon the national regulatory authority to decide. So it depends on what we propose. Is it depends on the aspect if there is a pan-European effect or not.
Thanks very much. Oh, we're getting lots of great food for thought from these. So a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A if you have them before we finally turn to Matt Allison, who hopefully is now sorted out his internet connection to finally tell us from the perspective of Vodafone what you see as the most important changes in our understanding of intermediary liability. Matt.
Thank you, Heidi. And just checking you can hear me okay.
We can, yep.
I had some issues with everyone disappearing from the screen one by one. I was left on my own. It's quite disconcerting, but back now. And thank you, first of all, for the invitation.
Oh, Matt, you've unfortunately your audio has fallen out a little bit, so we can't quite hear you. I wonder if you want to try turning off your video and see if that helps your bandwidth. Any improvement? That's fantastic. Yes, if you
Okay.
don't mind, that would be perfect. We can hear you perfectly now.
I will proceed. You'll have to do without looking at my face, which I'm sure is no great loss. Yeah, so I think I was invited just to provide a few reflections from the telco layer. And hopefully what I could do is ground this discussion just in a few of the technology considerations that we think imprint on the public policy decisions that we face. And I really want to give you a sense of essentially, why do we care as a network service provider, as an MNO, in discussions around content liability, intermediary liability. Just to begin with, I would caveat any remarks today with a comment to say a lot of what we're focused on is primarily work at the European and the national level in Europe, but of course that has a lot of implications and parallels for the policy discussion in the US as well that we can unpick later on. So just for the benefit of everyone in the audience, I'm sure you're all very familiar, but Vodafone is a global digital communication service, and we provide a variety of internet connectivity services. We're mainly known for our 3G, 4G, and in the future 5G mobile network coverage, but we also provide a variety of other content delivery, hosting, cloud services, and we have an IoT platform across Europe as well. But I would say for the purposes of this discussion, it's probably best to think about Vodafone first and foremost as a connectivity provider. So we transfer packets of information across the internet from point A to point B. And when we're approaching discussions around intermediary liability, I think first and foremost, it's useful for this discussion to think about our current status under the law in Europe and what that means for the roles and responsibilities that we have with respect to other partners in the digital ecosystem. So we're regulated under the e-commerce directive as an information society service. Within that, as I mentioned, we provide an internet access service, which means we benefit from the blanket liability exemption that applies for mere conduits within the directive. However, when we are made aware of illegal activities taking place, we do respond to blocking injunctions to disable access to illegal content at the domain layer. And I think this brings me to the sort of entry point for us in the discussion, which is to say, whilst that system has endured for a long time, the perspective that we have is that increasingly there is not a fair and kind of proportionate allocation of rights and responsibilities across the digital ecosystem, which target action where it's most needed, and which we would say is closest to I guess you'd say the source of the problematic content. What we do respond to blocking injunctions in our territories, but we see this very much as a tool of last resort. And one of the things that we're advocating for in the policymaking process, particularly now at the European level, is for more targeted action closer to the source of content, and embedding the principles of there being a cascading set of responsibilities online. And this is, I think, a legal concept which is embedded in already European legislation in the Enforcement Directive. I believe it's referenced in the 2018 recommendation on illegal content. This is a precedent that does exist. But essentially, our goal, of course, is to have a safer, a fairer, a less toxic digital ecosystem, which is beneficial for our customers, and to arrive at a situation where there is, as I said, a sort of a fair and proportionate balance of roles and responsibilities across the digital ecosystem. And I'm happy to elaborate on some of the points that we're making, particularly in relation to the Digital Services Act in Europe, which is the flagship, I think, policy initiative under this term, dealing with intermediary liability. But I'll pause there and happy to respond to any follow-up questions you might have.
Yeah, thanks so much, Matt. So I wonder, I have a couple of questions. One is, I'm just wondering if there was any particular experience that pushed Vodafone to start to change its position towards ideas of cascading responsibilities. Was it the number of blocking injunctions, or was there anything in particular that started to change the company's mind about what it wanted to see, or was it just a general evolution in thought? So I'd love to hear more about how this changed and why over time.
I mean, I wouldn't put it down to any individual event. I would say this is a process that we've all been part of over the past 5 or 10 years. So I think it's been mentioned, I kind of phased in and out some of the earlier discussions, but we're looking at the potted history of intermediary liability. And of course, the e-commerce directive is now 20 years old. And it certainly feels, from my perspective at least, that we've been having a very live discussion in Europe over the past 5 years around the future of intermediary liability. And the way that discussion has gone has been, do we now need to reopen and unpick, or at least clarify, some of the fundamental aspects of the law? And for the past, I guess you'd say, 3 or 4 years, the attitude was, no, it's sufficient at this stage just to give guidance, to kind of work through codes of conduct, self-regulatory codes, etc. But it does now seem that there is, I think, a body of evidence and a consensus across stakeholders who are participating in the Digital Services Act public consultation, that the time is now right to seize the initiative. And you can only go on so far applying additional guidelines, and of course responding to the case law from the European Court of Justice, which is, clarified and interpreted certain basic aspects of the original directive. But that situation can't go on forever, and at some point the legislator needs to use its right of initiative to actually put in place kind of updates to the law that mean it will be fit for purpose for the next 20 years, we would hope. And particularly looking at the variety, the diversity of digital services that are available on the market today that simply weren't conceived of at the time that the directive was introduced. So no, I wouldn't say there was a big bang moment, but it's just sort of cumulative effect of a number of years where this issue has been discussed. We've been around a few times. We've had discussions under the previous Juncker Commission around online platform. At least is minded to take up some of these issues, and as I say, use its right of initiative to actually clarify the situation. And broadly, that is something that we support.
Yeah, thanks. So thank you for all of these opening statements, which have given me a huge bunch of questions that we're going to delve into, and I'll weave in questions from the audience as they come up. So Matt, I mean, it's great to have you in this conversation, because sometimes the telco layer is a very under-discussed one. So I wanted to stick with you just for a moment to maybe tell us a little bit more about this idea of cascading responsibilities. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what you see as then a fair allocation of roles and responsibilities in this digital ecosystem.
Sure. So I think the way that we approach this is, first of all, to say that we do absolutely support the exemption from liability, the primary exemption from liability for online intermediaries, and that is something that should be kind of included and certainly maintained as part of the Digital Services Act. But where we do see that there could be, I think, targeted action is to look at the different categories that we have of service provider under the e-commerce directive, and to recognise that there is a development of a new, almost legal category of service that has happened over the past 20 years, where it would be helpful to define some additional obligations, and we can go into those. But I think they're broadly discussed, and essentially, what we would like to arrive at is a situation where the actual action can be taken closer to the end content, and that can be done through harmonised notice and action procedures across Europe, increased use of trusted flaggers, as was included in the 2018 recommendation on legal content, where possible, putting into play both human but also automated tools to achieve to prevent the persistent re-upload of identified illegal content. These are all things that can be done that mean that we can actually address the harm where it occurs on the internet, and that's something that we're certainly in favour of.
Thanks, Matt. So I wanted to open it up to the other three. So now Matt's kind of set out his stall of what Vodafone might like to see: action closer to end content, addressing harm closer to where it's actually happening. Do any one of you three want to jump in and say, does that sound to you like a fair allocation of roles and responsibilities? Any comments on that?
I'll jump in.
Go for it, Daphne.
So, I mean, I think this is very much built into the structure of both the e-commerce directive and laws like the DMCA in the US already. The idea that there are different classes of actors on the internet, and sort of the lower you are in the stack, the farther you are away from the user and the source of harm, the less responsibility you have to respond to it. And I think that I think that the roles within the internet stack have evolved so much since both of those laws were created that there are categories of technical intermediaries that we're not handling very well. So for example, back-end cloud service systems, or web hosting companies like Amazon Web Services, they function more like infrastructure. They don't have necessarily the capability to remove just a single illicit comment or a single illegal video. They can only do much blunter things like cut off an entire website. And the same is true of an intermediary like Cloudflare. And so I do think there's a need for laws to recognize that we don't want to put responsibility on these deeper infrastructural entities because they don't have the capability to respond in a very targeted way. That said, I would push back on one of the points that Matt made about preventing the re-upload of illegal content. This is something that most major platforms do already through matching duplicates of content for the sort of worst of the worst material out there, which is child sexual abuse material. But that's in a very special category because there is no lawful context in which that material could possibly appear. And so deploying an automated system to detect what's illegal and automatically take it down works relatively well for that kind of content. But once you get out of that space, and in particular into the space of violent extremist content, which is sort of often people's next ask for where automation should be used to take down content, you run into a lot of problems because the machines can't tell the difference between a video clip used as ISIS propaganda and that same video clip used in news reporting or counter speech against violent extremism or in academic commentary. And this is a really important question because it's at the center of the terrorist content regulation in Europe, which is entering what may be the final stage of trilogue negotiations this week to resolve whether European law will follow what had been the Commission's proposal, which is requiring platforms to deploy automated filters, which we know are clumsy and we know over-remove, or to follow the direction that the Parliament had recommended, which was not to have that kind of requirement. And this hasn't had a whole lot of attention in the news, but 3 UN human rights rapporteurs wrote to the negotiators citing human rights problems with the potential mandate. Within civil society and within academia, there's been a lot of pushback. There's a lot of pushback from human rights organizations in the Middle East who worry that they will be on the receiving end of a lot of the mistakes because of their experience already being on the receiving end of a lot of mistakes. So I think the idea that while I agree with putting responsibilities on platforms at the edge of the network, the idea that they can use technology that will magically differentiate between lawful and unlawful content without having a bunch of collateral damage, I think is far from established and is quite risky.
Markham, do you maybe want to come in on this, given that you have to work with a company that's trying to negotiate this exact minefield of automated filters versus other types of responsibility? So I'd love to hear your perspective, particularly on some of the things that Daphne said about the collateral damage, which can in some cases be quite huge when we use automated filters.
Yeah, sure. Well, first I'd say I do think both the EU and the US already recognize the concept of different responsibilities and roles depending on where one finds oneself in the technology stack, and then of course even in the content layers, perhaps the various roles that you might play, whether you're a search provider or you're a host of third-party apps. There may be differences there, and I think the DSA seems to at least is embracing the continuation of those different types of roles. I think we feel it's important for this to focus in terms of the law on unlawful content. The notice and takedown regime is an appropriate regime, partly for the reason that Daphne said, which is that it becomes very hard to proactively make decisions other than certain types of content, like the CSAM type of content that Daphne referenced. to contextualize whether that content is appropriate or not appropriate, as a matter of if there's an affirmative obligation to do so. Machines are getting better, but there's always going to be a category, at least for the foreseeable future, where they're just not going to be able to make those contextual decisions, and there can be collateral mistakes. But I'd also say, I think in terms of, you started out, Heidi, with how perceptions have changed. I think many internet companies were and still are supporters of the free flow of information, and want to err on that side of not infringing on the flow of speech. At the same time, I think increasingly we understand our roles and responsibilities in trying to provide a safe environment for users and for consumers. And I think that's something that I think many platforms have moved to that kind of recognition over the last several years. And I think that's really healthy. That's a good thing. How we mandate that kind of distinction of creating safe environments and the kind of the environment we want for users as a matter of law, I still think it's preferable to create the space for platforms to do that, rather than trying to mandate that harmful activity be taken down, and having governments make a decision about what might be harmful rather than unlawful.
And maybe if I can follow up, because I think Daphne also raised a really important point, which is the question of how do we know what mistakes are being made and how do we find them out? And I wonder, Markham, if you could just tell us a little bit more about, if you can, what is Google doing in that regard, and how is Google really trying to make sure that any machine learning automated filters don't embed within them types of bias that can end up, for example, throwing human rights organizations in the Middle
Sure.
East off of platforms. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, we published a set of principles in the AI context about that very thing, about creating systems that avoid bias. It's at least at the moment, there is always going to be a need for human review in these content and certain content decisions that are being made, so that that we can try to avoid some of those mistakes that Daphne mentioned. But in terms of the bias itself, it's something that I think every platform has to continually work on. It's not, press a button and you've eliminated all potential biases. So I think machines are getting smarter, they're getting better, they're learning, and that's what we want to see them do. But how do we prevent that? I think we prevent that by I think it's hard as a matter of law to prevent that, but it's something that the platforms need to continually work toward, to monitor their systems, try to be transparent as they can about the decisions they make, the content that they remove down, that they take down, and eliminate as much as they can built-in biases that might surface unintentionally.
Yeah, and I think this starts to move us into the big word transparency again. And I would say that the one thing that's been interesting for me sitting in Canada is to see how the Canadian government has tried to approach these questions of algorithms and their impact. So for example, whenever any algorithm will be used within the Canadian government, before implementing that algorithm, the government is required to carry out an algorithmic impact assessment to try and figure out exactly these types of unintended consequences. Will it result in exclusions, marginalization of racialized communities, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very much a kind of ex ante principle in many ways to ensure that any type of algorithm that is employed will not have an impact that is in some way discriminatory or even unintentionally illegal. So that starts to sort of flip the script on what one tries to do there. So I think there's a lot of interesting ideas about how one can do these things. But I think it brings us to these questions of transparency. So I wanted to turn to Wilhelm Eschweiler and ask him to tell us a little bit more about transparency, because I noticed when you were talking about the surveys that you've been conducting, that you were mostly asking users rather than necessarily platforms. So I wonder, even in conducting that kind of study, what type of transparency might you like to have seen from online platforms, and what do you think that might have achieved given your own experience in trying to gather information to create regulation? Daphne, Markham, can you hear him? Unfortunately, I cannot hear you at the moment. Let's try, now you're on mute, let's try unmuting again and see if that works. Let's give it one more try. Unfortunately not. Let's, if you don't mind, I'll leave you to try and keep playing around with that, and maybe I'll ask Daphne then the same question, if you just want to say a little bit about how you see this kind of question of transparency. So Markham had talked about, okay, transparency on principles, transparency on how decisions are made, transparencies on process. If you want to throw anything else into the mix about how you would define transparency.
Sure. Well, so the best research we have on what really happens in notice and takedown systems comes from the Lumen database, which is hosted at the Berkman Center at Harvard. And what makes it so special and important is that it isn't a source of aggregate numbers put together by platforms with a sort of, you'll have to trust us that this is the number of hate speech items we took down. It isn't an aggregate set of numbers like you see in platform transparency reports. Instead, it is a repository of raw data that academics can come and pore over quite clumsily. But it's copies of takedown requests and information about whether they were honored. And that allows researchers to come along and see how many of the requests were valid, or how many of the requests came from a competitor trying to silence another competitor, which in one early study was over 50%. It allows researchers to look at what's actually going on and what content was affected and what people were affected, and reach meaningful conclusions independently, without relying on platforms to characterize what happens. So that is, in one sense, the best model for transparency. That is the thing that allows actual independent analysis. At the same time, it requires disclosing what is potentially private data about either the user who was affected or the person requesting the takedown. It requires disclosing content that someone alleged was illegal, which works for some things in the Lumen database, in particular for copyright notices to Google's web search product. But it's hard to identify how you do that if what you're talking about is illegal, violent extremist content or defamation, et cetera. And so figuring out a way forward to allow, for example, tiered access where researchers who are vetted can see some additional information and the public can see more aggregate information, I think is one of the most important goals and challenges of the pending legislation that we have in the EU and hopefully also in the US. Because without that kind of access for researchers to make independent assessment of what actually happened, we are all stuck just relying on platforms' characterization. And I believe that the platforms I'm familiar with are trying hard to characterize things accurately, but they can't know their own blind spots and weaknesses. And there's a great public need to understand better what is going on.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more on the tiered access, and I've often thought that what we can also do is look to other industries where this happens, right? I mean, it's always a very delicate and important balance between privacy and tiered access for researchers, and we've obviously seen in the online space that go wrong with things like Cambridge Analytica, but we also see lots of other spaces where extremely sensitive data is used by researchers. One classic example, of course, is healthcare, where you have lots of big data research, including sometimes on recorded conversations between a GP and a patient, which is what I know some researchers are doing, for example, in Ontario, so they can figure out how can you improve doctor-patient communication. So we're talking about research into the most intimate private details of someone's life, and there are data protection rules around that and how you can access that data, so that you can really try to ensure exactly some of the things that you're talking about. So I think we do have some useful models. Tax data is another example where we could do that. So let's go back to Wilhelm and see if we have solved the sound issue. Do you want to give it another try? Well, we'll see if you can figure out with the event admin behind the scenes so we can have you join us for the end of this conversation. But mercifully, we have two panelists with, I think, a lot more, at least, questions from my perspective. So one, there are a couple of words that we haven't said, or that I'd love us to delve in a little bit more. And one, big change, of course, over the last 20 years has been the use of algorithms in this space, and the question of whose algorithms, how they're changing, et cetera, which I think is, in some cases, a little bit different than machine learning. So I wonder, Markham, if you could say a little bit more about how you see that. So you talked about, transparency on principles, decisions, processes. Do you also think there should be transparency on algorithms, or where do you see that balance between proprietary algorithms versus what regulators or publics or researchers in a tiered access system would need to know to be able to do research? Where do you see that really important balance lie?
Hi. Okay, so algorithms, look, I think this is difficult. There's obviously two considerations from our perspective. One is not threatening sort of commercially sensitive processes and trade secrets, right? In how we develop our business and our services, and I think that would be shared across industry players, and there'd be some agreement on policymakers that we wouldn't want to do that. Secondly, obviously, to avoid, we're constantly addressing spam, right? Even search spam, and how to balance against gaming our algorithms to highlight content that wouldn't by itself warrant being content that would be at the top of a search query request. At the end of the day, we want to provide what's going to be the most accurate, useful, and relevant information in as quick a time as possible to people. So our algorithms are an important part of that. So with those two considerations in mind, I think what Daphne mentioned is kind of interesting, having some sort of tiered processes potentially with academics. I think for governments to try to have a system of looking at algorithms themselves, I'm more skeptical of that, of a regulatory regime looking at algorithms. But again, I think we're in this conversation a bit in the DSA, and certainly potentially in the AI files in both Europe and in the US. And it may be that there's verticals where those kind of decisions are like health data or other things where you have a sort of a different approach depending on the sensitivity of the kind of information. So it may not be a satisfactory answer, and that I'm not sure I have a solution to it. I know what concerns we have in terms of the potential commercial effects, and how hard we work on trying to get algorithms right. And again, I think this is where the conversation is helpful to continue to see if we can have a common understanding of what would be most helpful while accounting for issues like the commercial sensitivity, privacy, and other things.
Yeah, thanks. All right. Dr. Eschweiler, let's see if leaving and rejoining has solved our connectivity problem.
Can you hear me now?
We can. Perfect. It's amazing how 95% of computer problems are solved by turning it off and turning it back on again. So let me then return to the question that I'd asked you about when you were doing your own studies, what kind of transparency and information you'd like to have had from platforms, and what you think that might have helped you achieve.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the floor. And I beg your sorry, I felt a little bit lost when I was sitting here and just understanding nothing. So first of all, it's difficult to define, from my point of view, to define transparency, especially since it depends on who you want to create transparency for. Transparency for business means something different than for the end user. That's clear. With regard to business customers, the existing requirements of the platform to business regulation already offer a good starting point, as they already demand transparency, especially with regard to the ranking and its related parameters. It might still be helpful to be more specific or explicit, but these are the details. Above all, it will be more important to ensure the enforcement of such transparency requirements by regulatory authorities. With a view to end users, transparency can be achieved in various ways and with regard to many aspects, especially through general terms, conditions, or regarding transparent information on complaint management, etc. Our monitoring exercise clearly demonstrates that there is still a lot to do to ensure sufficient transparency. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe sticking with you while the sound is functioning, I wanted to ask, because of course you said at the beginning that your agency really deals with economic regulation, and this of course has been a big debate within this space. There are so many places one could change things, should change things, and where is, often amongst academics as well, the debate is, where is the real driver of change? Is it within economics? Is it within intermediary liability, etc.? So I wonder, and I wanted to ask you then, from your perspective, how far you see this economic regulation as the real driver of reform, rather than, for example, content regulation. I think it's particularly interesting to discuss in light of the fact that Germany sort of gained its international prominence in this arena through content regulation, or content enforcement regulation, we might say, through NetzA. So how far do you see this sort of economic angle as being one that could be a real driver of change? We have unfortunately lost your sound again for some unknown reason.
Better? It's now
better. It's perfect. There we go.
Oh, great. What a day. As you have outlined, my authority is not in charge of content regulation, but the special law you have mentioned, this the German NetzDG law, differs from my authority intended approach with regard to the scope as well as to the objective. It is important to note that this special law only addresses operators of social networks who have more than 2 million registered users in Germany. Professional networks, specialist portals, and in particular sales platforms are in this way not included. In terms of content, this special law aims at preventing illegal content such as hate speech and so on. But our proposal for an economic ex-ante regulation, which I just have presented, aims at securing fair and consentable conditions. So from my point of view, it's the economic side who is the key driver of the development.
Yeah, thank you. And I wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about what you think will change with this regulation. How you think this economic regulation might change this space for the better, for example, for the small businesses and end users you talk to.
Which one is this? Yeah, I think these ex-ante rules of conduct on digital platforms with significant intermediate power, this is the advantage in regard of these complicated rules of antitrust or competitive, or like the competition authority has to deal with, because you need a lot of market analysis to do. That is very complicated, it's very complex, and what we are proposing, what is our approach, is to do it in a very quick way and to do it in a very simple way, because you don't need a kind of market analysis. We are looking in a regime which has as a precondition this significant intermediate power, and if this is fulfilled, we are ready for a certain ex-ante regulation. And I think this is a very step forward, because from a philosophical point of view, what we are proposing is a level playing field between those layers on the telecommunication networks and those who are playing in the platform philosophy. And if you think in regard of, for instance, net neutrality, all those players have to fulfill the same responsibilities. So it is at the end of the day a question of a level playing field, a question of fairness. It's a question, how should I say, a behavior which you have to fulfill in other markets too. So it's nothing special, but I think platforms, digital platforms, are not living in a zoo. they have to live in a special regulatory framework. And this is our proposal, and this is a simple proposal, and this is a fair proposal, and it's not a kind of overregulation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm glad that you're in this conversation, because it does take us away from what this sometimes devolves into, which is specific examples of individual pieces of content and extrapolating from those single pieces, and often, maybe to jump on something that Daphne hinted to, regulators or others, in the absence of full information, will seize on those individual examples to then discuss or justify certain pieces of regulation, right? In part because of the things that they don't know, or the unknown unknowns. And I think economic regulation is one example of a conversation that proposes other solutions. So I'm wondering from Daphne and Markham, whether you think there are other solutions, or Markham, you mentioned incentives that are not actually receiving enough airtime, that we focus so much on, for example, notice and takedown, et cetera, that we've not thought about other types of solutions and incentives. We put transparency on the table, and I'm wondering if there are others that you think deserve more airtime and discussion than they're getting.
Well, I mean, I think one of the most important and under-examined ways forward runs right through Dr. Eschweiler's area of expertise. It is at the convergence of competition regulation and content regulation, because the questions that we're asking about platform power over public discourse today have a lot of precedent in the questions that we asked about the owners of previous essential communications channels. We asked this about radio broadcast licensees. We asked this about television broadcast and about cable. And that is, that's the area the people at this event understand deeply. And there's a real need for that expertise in the conversation about platform regulation today. That's sort of for both a policy reason and a practical reason. The practical reason is Europe is already moving forward to regulate platforms like broadcasters. Like, this is what the revised audio video media services directive does for video hosting platforms like YouTube, creating new and quite far-reaching authority over them for media regulators, particularly in Ireland, because so many major platforms are established there. So there's a practical reason that we need to look to media and telecoms regulation. And then there's a policy reason, because of this convergence of questions about competition and ownership of infrastructure, and questions about speech regulation. I actually wrote about this in a piece called "Who Do You Sue?" Focused on the US precedent, in cases like Turner 1 and Turner 2, where, the question is, when and how does the government override the preferences of a private actor about what to do with its communications platform in order to impose some kind of mandate that's based on some other consideration of the public interest. And I won't nerd out on that any further, because it's probably a little too deep in the legal weeds. But I think we will be seeing a lot of developments in this direction in the coming years. And so it's really valuable to have people with the background in communications be part of this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Before I let Markham join in, of course, everything that you just said is music to my ears as a trained historian who often writes about previous regimes. And I would say that it has, I think, been a problem in this conversation that if we say things are unprecedented, we don't actually look to the many discussions that I can tell you from spending many years in archives looking at radio regulation from the 1920s are remarkably similar, including questions around, as Evelyn Douek has written, around content cartels, while from the mid-19th century to 1939, there was an actual cartel of content, which was news agencies who created private rules of the game. And it's a very, very different in some ways from what we have now, but also I think instructive in seeing how choices made by platforms or regulators shaped these markets in all sorts of intended and unintended ways, including previous attempts to create global content rules and so on. So I too could nerd out for a long time, but I think it's quite right. I mean, especially in law, precedent is so incredibly important. But more than that, even in the antitrust world, for anybody who wants to delve deeper, there are, I think, historians who tell us all sorts of interesting things, like Naomi Lamoureux or Richard John, who've looked, for example, at the breakup of AT&T, or cases like US versus AP. There are lots of ways in which antitrust has been used within the communications sector before, I would say often with unintended and interesting consequences that are worth considering and that we often don't see in some of these conversations. So Markham, let me turn to you then and ask you the same question. Are the solutions or incentives not receiving enough airtime? Anything else you want to throw on the table?
Wow, Daphne's reference to Turner 1 and Turner 2 is giving me interesting memories of my former life as a telecom lawyer and practitioner. I think this conversation shows how complicated this is, because there's issues of, sort of telecom regulation, broadcasters versus telecoms versus information services, and the frameworks we've approached there, and then the antitrust and the framework we've approached to antitrust. So, look, I think one could regulate an entity sort of under a more of a telecom regime, sort of essential services regime, and a company might be okay with that for a guaranteed rate of return, which is sort of the historical tit for tat in that space. But what often suffers is then innovation in that space. And I think I generally feel like the distinction between information services and that content layer versus sort of the telecom space and the infrastructure space is a good distinction. And we want to be more light touch when it comes to the content layer and not do things that disincentivize innovation. And one could see a company saying, we'd be happy to trade innovation for a guaranteed rate of return. With that'll give us certainty for 20 years. So we'll take the regulation to lock us in our marketplace. I don't think that's a good policy place for us, for regulators, or for where we want to go, that direction of travel. And so I think we want to. I guess that's a way of saying that I think a more light touch approach when it comes to the content layer is generally going to be better for society. I think that's been proven out. Secondly, when it comes to sort of the antitrust competition space, of course, the scrutiny here is appropriate, and Google has experience with some scrutiny globally in this space as well. And I think that what we'd want to do is to ground the approach in economic principles and econometric principles and sound econometric principles. It's not to say that we ought not to have some sort of new regulatory framework in a particular case, but they ought to be grounded in econometrics rather than things that traditionally have not been antitrust considerations, which I think sometimes the content issues get conflated in that space. And in particular, with Google, we do have these vertical components so that if you search for something on the internet, we might show you a map location rather than a link to a content page, because we know that that's what's going to be most appropriate for the user searching for that information. So if they search for, emergency room, that they're going to get a map of an emergency room first. That's kind of a vertical combination of our map product and our search product that creates, I think, real consumer benefit and real consumer efficiencies. So I think as we look at the ex-ante pieces, we want to be careful about the effect potentially on innovation, and not be dogmatic necessarily in saying there ought to be rigid classifications of different kind of vertical services that never intertwine.
Yeah, thank you. So as one historian hat aside, what you mentioned, this question of cartels, innovation, et cetera, is actually a live historical debate, as well as historians contemplate, what did the sort of not quite cartel, but oligopoly of telegraph cables in the 19th century do for innovation, right? Did it stymie it? What kind of innovation was possible? How did it work? So there's some very interesting, I think, historical debates around exactly these questions, trying to really unpack when we look at different types of regulation, what did and didn't it do, including within the United States, but also globally for innovation, what type of innovation was possible. So there's lots of interesting, I think, work to be done there to think through these questions. Now, I see that we're coming somewhat towards the end of our time, and I want to make sure I ask a question, which of course everybody is asking, but I think is crucial, which is the question of how COVID 19 has or hasn't changed any of your views on these matters? Has it been something that simply accelerated what you already believed, or has it changed things in some sort of fundamental way as to how you look at intermediary liability and platform responsibilities? So accelerant, change, what would you say? I'm going to give each one of you could keep it to about a minute. So maybe we'll start with Dr. Eschweiler in the hope that the that the sound is working, whether COVID has changed your views on any of these questions.
Reinforced. Due to this crisis, many aspects of our professional life, but also our private everyday life, has been shifted to the digital environment in a very rapid and intensive manner. No doubt about that. And who has not enjoyed a large number of professional and private video conferences or online shopping experience in the last month? This has notably intensified the strong position of certain digital platforms. Please allow me that. And the already identified dependencies and issues. The impression is also confirmed by the business customers of digital platforms in the course of our ongoing monitoring activities. If one may speak of winners in connection with the COVID-19 crisis, that all the winners would be the digital platforms being active in the e-commerce segment. And please allow me one final word. What we are proposing is also a kind of light touch regulation, because what we have proposed should be done matter of course in a fair and competitive business environment. That means transparency and a kind of non-discrimination. And in my point of view, that what we are proposing is balanced and not over-regulation, and it's a kind of light touch regulation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And Matt, Allison, if you can hear me and want to throw in a last few words.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. So just if you want to say...
I've been following along. It's fine, yes.
Right.
I think the question was on the impact of COVID, no? I just got the end of it. Yeah, well, so I would say, as with most things, it's just intensified, I think, the existing position. So going into this, we were looking at the role of digital platforms for commerce, for communication, etc. And what's happened is that we've become, I think, all of us, both businesses and individuals, more dependent on online communications platforms like our conferencing platform today. And as you can see, when it doesn't work terrifically, it has some problems. But I think that just serves to underline the point, particularly as we're looking at making sure that our customers have access to credible, reliable, trustworthy sources of information online. It's important that we have an intermediary liability framework that facilitates that. So I think that's really one of the key learnings that we have coming out of the crisis. I mean, I think it's a bit late in the day to introduce this notion, but of course you will have seen in Europe, we did have some issues in the early phase of the pandemic around 5G conspiracy theories linked to the coronavirus, which actually led to attacks on some mobile base stations, harassment of our network engineers. And that activity is by definition illegal. So, you know, we have worked with the platforms to ensure that those kind of targeted campaigns that were causing acts of violence will be addressed. But I think there is a wider problem which it could sit outside of the Digital Services Act. It might be more to do with the EU Democracy Action Plan, but which is around access to quality, credible information online and preventing the dissemination of misinformation online. And that will be a really important factor coming out of the pandemic for platforms, communication service providers, for individuals.
Thanks so much. Markham.
Yeah, thank you. I think what it's done is really this trend that I mentioned of companies like Google that started out as companies that really wanted to facilitate the free flow of information and looked at the upside of that. And certainly there is an upside to one that's increasingly recognized as well, that the responsibility of facilitating speech, and particularly speech that is harmful and dangerous or unlawful. And I think COVID, there was that reaffirmed the direction of travel of our thoughts there. We found ourselves feeling a tremendous amount of responsibility to work with authorities to uplift credible sources of reliable data for people, as well as degrading or blocking harmful misinformation, including the sort of the information like the 5G conspiracy theories and the like. So that's on the content side. On the second, but we did other things. We really felt the responsibility. So we worked with Apple to create an open source contact tracing app to try to be part of a solution there, which has been widely adopted in the EU and increasingly in the US, with our small businesses to try to provide them tools to be able to survive a pandemic and find ways to reach consumers in different ways in an online environment. So I feel that I know that COVID for Google provided a sense of real responsibility and a sense that we could be part of a solution and rather than create problems.
Thanks very much. And lastly, Daphne.
Two things. The first learning of COVID is that automated content moderation systems and filtering tools don't work all that well. And we know this because companies announced that they were moving to relying on these tools more, and then they announced that there had been more mistakes as a result. So that's not very surprising, but it's good to have the data. Secondly, it has changed my thinking about how important infrastructural tools are and what we consider infrastructure. I think for many people, for my children, for example, for distance learning, Zoom is critical infrastructure. And so I think we don't want to be putting content moderation responsibilities on entities that function that way because of this inevitable trend where they, err on the side of taking down too much and are silencing the wrong things. So this kind of gets back to the point Matt was making at the very beginning about the importance of identifying within the internet's many overlapping players, which are the ones who appropriately should be given responsibility over content and which should not, and should perhaps be subject to something more like a traditional common carriage regime.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you to all four of you. This has been, despite some small technical difficulties, I think a really wide-ranging conversation. We've gone from transparency to 5G conspiracy theories, from talking about end users to talking about business, competition and content regulation in the EU and in North America. It's certainly given me plenty of food for thought as I go about my day that begins here in Vancouver. I hope the same is true for everybody who was listening. Thank you so much to our four panelists, Matt, Allison, Markham, Eriksson, Daphne, Keller, and Wilhelm Eschweiler. I believe this has been recorded if you would like to look at it and revisit it at a later date. So it remains for me just to say thank you again to the panelists. Thank you to the IIC for organizing this panel. And I hope you all have a wonderful